We'll be studying about inflationary gap, and this is caused by creation of excess demand in the economy. So if you see the graph, before we study the graph, we must learn to explain what is excess demand. Excess demand means that aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply required for maintenance of full employment equilibrium output. Again, I am repeating, see over here, excess demand is excess demand is nothing but aggregate demand greater than aggregate supply for maintenance of full employment level equilibrium output, and it's because of this excess demand that inflationary gap is created in the economy. Understanding this graph, on the x-axis we have income, output and employment, and on the y-axis what we have shown is the aggregate demand. Clear? Now this is your supply curve, this is your aggregate demand curve. This is drawn at 45-degree angle, and the place where aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve intersect, that is the full employment equilibrium. Now beyond this, either if it is below or above, that will not be full employment equilibrium. So the point at which the aggregate demand curve and aggregate supply curve intersect, that is the full employment equilibrium, and in our graph it is at point E. Our full employment equilibrium is shown at point E. Now talking about how to explain inflationary gap in the economy, as I told you, inflationary gap is caused by creation of excess demand. Excess demand means that aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply. So when we are saying demand is greater than supply, how do we explain it? We are explaining it by movement of the aggregate demand curve on account of change in investment, because we've done in a two-sector model, aggregate demand is equal to consumption expenditure plus investment expenditure, and change in aggregate demand, meaning we are talking about increase in aggregate demand, is shown by a change in I. Clear? So the new equilibrium will be achieved at point E. This is the point of new equilibrium at point F. So if we have to explain what is the inflationary gap which has been created on account of shift or increase in aggregate demand, this is the inflationary gap. EF is the inflationary gap which has been created on account of excess demand in the economy, and already we have studied in the initial, when I started the presentation, I told you that aggregate demand is nothing but excess demand is nothing but aggregate demand greater than aggregate supply for maintenance of full employment equilibrium. Now since we've shown that this is the inflationary gap in the economy, we must know what are the correct words to explain inflationary gap in the economy. Inflationary gap means the actual, please remember the word actual, aggregate demand is greater than the aggregate demand required for full employment equilibrium level of output, and this is what we termed as inflationary gap. So here, because of increase in aggregate demand, the inflationary gap which is caused is this much. This is the inflationary gap which is created. Apart from this, you must know how to, or what are the reasons for excess demand in the economy. So the first reason for excess demand in the economy is the increase in propensity to consume. So excess demand is caused when people want to increase the consumption expenditure. People increase the consumption expenditure, excess demand would be caused in the economy. If taxes reduce, which means more disposable income in the hands of the reduction in taxes means more disposable income in the hands of the consumer. If a person has more income at his disposal, then he can create more demand in the economy. The next reason for excess demand being created is because government expenditure has increased. If government expenditure increases, it is straightforward, meaning that people will have more money in the hands. If people have more money in the hands, that means the consumption expenditure would increase, and consequently demand will be more in the economy. The next reason for creation of excess demand, it could be because of increase in investment. If increase in investment is taking place because rate of interest has gone down. We have studied that investment is inversely proportional to the rate of interest. If interest rate goes up, the investment goes down, and this we can put, if rate of interest goes down, investment goes up. So if the investment expenditure increase or the investment increases, means more money coming in the hands of the public, which means that the excess demand would be created in the economy. The third reason would be that the imports go down. If imports go down, then what will happen? In that case, again, the pressure will be built on the existing goods which are produced locally. Why could imports go down? What could be the reason for imports going down? It could be because imports have gone down because the international prices have increased compared to the domestic prices, and if this happens, again what will happen is the demand for locally produced goods would increase, and if demand increases beyond the capacity to produce, there could be excess demand in the economy. The next reason is exports. If exports increase, simple reason, if exports increase, then there will be more demand for locally produced goods. Reason for exports increasing meaning would be because our prices are less. If prices are less, then our goods which are produced locally will be in more demand in the international markets, or because the exchange rate has decreased, so it becomes cheaper for the foreigners to buy our goods. And the last reason for creation of excess demand in the market is deficit financing, and simple definition of deficit financing is increase in money supply. This increase in money supply is due to printing of paper currency. Next important thing which the examiner could ask you is, what is the impact of excess demand? So if we talk about the impact of excess demand in the economy, we can explain that in terms of output, there won't be any change because the economy is already working at full employment level at point E. In case of employment, there will again be no change because the economy is working at full employment level. But in case of prices, there will be an increase in prices because aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply, and this increase in price is known as inflation. So when we are doing this topic, we must know three things. Number one is explanation of the graph, second is reasons for excess demand, and the third is impact of excess demand. We must know how to explain the definition of excess demand. We must know how to explain what is inflationary gap. Winding up, I need to tell you again that excess demand is when aggregate demand is more than aggregate supply to maintain full employment level of output. And what is inflationary gap? Inflationary gap is caused by excess demand. It is when actual aggregate demand is more than the aggregate demand required for establishing full employment level of equilibrium.